One of the arguments that is overlooked that I've really tried to hammer home the last few years, particularly in regard to demonstrating the contradictions in the Vatican I and then Vatican II doctrine of the papacy, is the notion of the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop. If we go back in time to the 11th century and we look at what's known as the Gregorian reforms, and this is Gregory the Seventh in the 11th century, around 1190. And if you look at the scholarship, whether it's Szyszynski or whether it's Fordham University, they will note that this was entered into the papal register. So it did have some degree of officialdom at this time in regard to the papacy. And even if a Roman Catholic wants to disagree with that, it's not going to be a huge deal, because we're going to see that a couple centuries later, the same idea will also be there about 300 years later. Now, note that this is a radical change from the ecclesiology of the church prior to 1090, and it's famously known as the Gregorian Reforms. If you doubt me on that, you'll notice that the recently approved papal document, the Alexandria document from June 7, 2023, admits that this is a radical reformation and change in ecclesiology under the Gregorian Reforms right here in the first 3 to 4 paragraphs. It even notes that this change was largely supported by fraudulent forged documents. It mentions, for example, the false decretals, donation of Constantine, and there were many others as well that contributed to this, such as the Sammachian forgeries, which is where we get the first known use of the phrase, "no one judges the first see." Now, to go back to the Fordham document, the Fordham document or version of Dictatus Papae notes that the Roman Church was founded by God alone. The Roman Pontiff alone is the universal bishop. He alone can reinstate and depose bishops. Now we know this does become normative, because after this period in the Latin West, the Pope is the only figure who creates bishops. However, prior to this, obviously, and everyone I think admits this, who knows anything about church history, the way that a bishop is appointed is by other bishops. So there was no need for or expectation that the Bishop of Rome would anoint or would consecrate or approve all bishops in the world. Obviously, this is completely impractical too, given the ancient world, how it was structured and how far apart people were. The Pope alone is able to depose anyone in the world. The Pope alone is able to excommunicate anyone in the world. For him alone it is lawful to make and assemble congregations. He alone may use the imperial insignia. Now notice that Proposition 8 here is giving him geopolitical state power. And you'll notice there are similar ones about his is the only name in the world. His is the one in which all princes of the world must kiss his feet. So this is eventually what's going to be known as the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop. So a lot of people, when I made this argument the other day, they totally missed the point. They totally misunderstood what I was saying. They thought I was saying that it's just a question of whether you can be saved in or outside the Roman Catholic Church. I do think the Roman Catholic Church contradicts on that point, but they have a lot of nuanced explanations and casuistry to try to explain that away. So I'm going to go with something that's even clearer. I'm just going to talk about the temporal supremacy doctrine. This is the idea that we first see outlined here, again, based on forgeries, that the Pope is not just the spiritual head of the church, but he's also the head of all world empires. He is the ultimate temporal authority too. So he also has temporal authority as well as spiritual authority. It doesn't mean that there are no other temporal authorities. There are kings, of course. But the purpose of this document, particularly we're going to move a couple centuries later to Unam Sanctam, Boniface VIII in 1302. And in Unam Sanctam, the dogma that's proclaimed here, now keep in mind, this is for the entire church. It's specified to be very clear and very explicit that all must accept this. It's not just the idea that there is a spiritual head of the church that the Pope has, but that the Pope is also the head of all world rulers. In other words, he is the King of Kings. He is the Emperor of Emperors. Again, it's the very same terminology that was used in Dictatus Papae a couple centuries earlier about the only person who can use throughout the world the imperial insignia is the Pope. So he is both a spiritual head and a world geopolitical head. So he is both church and state. Now, in the earlier Byzantine doctrine of Symphonia, you'll note that the symbology was always the two-headed eagle. The Byzantine double-headed eagle symbolized the patristic first millennium church and its doctrine of church and state in a two spheres but one body conception. This is an alteration to where now the Pope is both the spiritual and the imperial head of all temporal authorities. And so it notes that not only must you believe in the doctrine of the papacy as the spiritual head of the church, you must also believe in the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop to be saved as well. That is the purpose of this document. It's one of the most famous documents in church history. It's famous precisely because it is positing that there is also a temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop. And it's exactly what was stated in the earlier document, Dictatus Papae. This becomes the basis for why later on in the Renaissance era, the papacy can have standing armies. The papacy can go to war. He can call for looting and pillaging based on who doesn't submit to him. Join with me or I will excommunicate you. Now, the oddity here is that if you go back to the Council of Chalcedon, in the Canons of Chalcedon, Canon 7 noted that it is not allowed for clergy to become rulers or heads of state or enter into secular office. So notice the older Chalcedonian idea, even when there were Christian emperors, it didn't allow for clerics to enter into civil state service because there was a division of powers. But by the time of Dictatus Papae, and by the time of the other documents that we're talking about here, like Unam Sanctum, you have an evolution, especially after the Gregorian reforms, of greater and greater temporal, worldly, geopolitical power of the papacy. And this is key because it's an obvious revolution in ecclesiology, in the church. Eventually, if you don't know, the Pope begins to wear what's called a triple crown. And the triple crown was a symbol of this three-tiered authority, right? That the Pope was not just a spiritual head, but that he is the head also of state. So 3 tiers, right? And you can look it up. You'll find it all over. And have you noticed that you don't see the papal tiara worn anymore? That's because after Vatican II, and we're going to see why in a minute, the papacy rejected wearing the triple crown. As far as I know, John the 23rd was the last to wear it, and that's not accidental, or maybe Paul VI wore it at one time. But the triple crown, this is a Photoshop. The Benedict did not wear the triple crown because after Vatican II, this gets discarded. And it's discarded because the Roman Catholic Church no longer holds to the doctrine of the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop. But here's the key point. If you read Unam Sanctum, which is not very long, it notes that not only must you believe in the spiritual power of the Pope as the one single head, you must also believe in his temporal authority. And it says at the end of the document that this is absolutely necessary for salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff, not just in terms of his spiritual authority to be saved. You also have to be subject temporally to the Roman bishop. And the logic of the whole paper is that the spiritual is above the temporal, so clearly the Pope, as the highest spiritual authority on earth, is above all of the rulers. So he's also the King of Kings. He's the Quisatz Haderach, the universe's ruler and super being on earth as well. Now, as the Reformation and other events occurred, you had the dissolution, the split in the West, and as the papacy began to lose over a time its temporal authority and power, it began to have to make concessions. Now, we believe it was already compromised a long time ago, but specifically the compromise that we're talking about today is already condemned. Keep this in mind. If you read the Syllabus of Errors, and if you read, for example, Libertas of Pope Leo XIII, if you come down to, say, we'll start with Libertas, say about paragraph 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, etc., pretty much until the end of the document. It's kind of a long encyclical, but really what I'm referring to is found in those paragraphs. You'll note that there he's talking about the condemnation of the Protestant doctrine of liberty of worship, freedom of conscience. Those are famous doctrines that the Reformers championed, right? If you didn't know this, Luther, Calvin, and others argued that we Protestants should have the freedom to worship. We should not be bound by any sort of Catholic state that could tell us it's wrong to do this or that. And likewise, it's not just Libertas of Leo XIII. It's also documents like Quanta Cura, condemning modern errors of Pius IX, the Pope of Vatican I, that to believe in religious liberty and the de-Catholicizing and de-Christianizing of the state is a heresy. So it's condemned in Quanta Cura. It's condemned in Leo XIII's Libertas. These are official, by the way, condemnations from the papacy. It's also condemned in the Syllabus of Errors of Pius IX, which is attached to Vatican I. It, for example, declares that you may not allow freedom of worship, that the church that the state should not be de-Christianized, the church should never work together with the state, you should not have a Catholic state, etc. All of these things are condemned many times over in this famous document from 1864, the Syllabus of Errors. And it's part of Vatican I. You can go read these for yourself. Now, most of the time, Roman Catholics have never read these things. They're not even aware of what these things are, what these documents are. They've never heard of this. But if you don't know, there's also a famous a feast day called Christ the King. And it was instituted, if you read the history of it, precisely to rebut. I think it's let's see if it's not an encyclical, but it might be an allocution, or it's called Quas Primas. It is an encyclical. So if you look up Quas Primas, this is a famous encyclical instituting the Feast of Christ the King, and the purpose of the Feast of Christ the King was to combat the Protestant and liberalizing modernist error that the state should be de-Christianized and no longer should be Catholic, quote unquote, or Christian. So it's another attestation to them adding to their own calendar in the Roman Catholic Church a document geared against religious liberty. And yet, what happens at Vatican II? Well, at the time of Vatican II, after all of these condemnations prior to Vatican II, which are very explicit, by the way, you have the acceptance of religious liberty, freedom of conscience, and freedom of worship. This is the document called Lumen Gentium. Excuse me, not Lumen. It's the document called Dignitatis Humanae. Here, this one. Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae. And here we have, again, I would say one of the most explicit rejections of the previous condemnations of religious liberty. And the argument is very explicit, very clear, that no, the church must also have a reference to the civil order and to the state. You should not de-Christianize the states, etc. All right, that's part of this. Now we're told that, no, that should be done. We should have total religious liberty, and so it's a capitulation to the Protestant doctrine. Now, I'm sure Roman Catholics are going to have their, but it doesn't really mean that, then that's a different kind of religious liberty. Well, set that aside, but the reason I bring it up is because the reason that they no longer hold to the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop, and it's not said to be something necessary for salvation, is because they had to capitulate to religious liberty for various reasons, because of geopolitical pressures and so forth, at the time of Vatican II. So if you believe in religious liberty, well, obviously you can't enforce the doctrine that you must be in temporal submission to the Roman bishop to also be saved, or that you must also believe in the temporal supremacy of the Roman bishop to be saved, you see. But that's precisely what they had already dogmatized back in 1302. But now they're allowed to do this revisionist exercise to where, well, that's not really required for salvation anymore, because we have liberalized the papacy. We've taken off the Triple Crown. In fact, we go and pray in mosques towards Mecca with the Muslims. No longer do we call crusades against Muslims, we now pray in the mosques with them towards Mecca, which is an action of apostasy in Roman Catholic moral law and canon law and theology. So you can see that the submission of the temporal power and supremacy, the doctrine has changed. That is another contradiction. It's another proof that Roman Catholicism is a geopolitical tool, a mafia group that essentially capitulates to whatever is needed at the time. If it's the Middle Ages, you can call crusades against the Muslims, and that's true trad Catholicism's doctrine. Nowadays, no, you didn't even have to call crusades. Why didn't you just go pray together in the mosques? So you can see that the papacy, when it became a geopolitical power, particularly in the 11th century in its most powerful form in the sense of temporal, when it really kicks off, the really popping off temporal power, it begins in these Gregorian reforms and it evolves into something that eventually becomes a disaster for the Roman Catholic Church, such that he has to take his triple crown off and then eventually admit that now it's time to de-Christianize Catholic states, as even Benedict the XVI himself said when he was Pope. This is a clear contradiction. It's 100% a rejection of what the Roman Catholic Church taught dogmatically 1,000 years ago. And so this alone, along with many other things, constitutes a systemic level defeater for the Catholic Church. Notice to those that are watching this or hearing me make this argument, I didn't argue that you have money corruption and we don't. Again, because every time I make these points, the Roman Catholic responds with a whataboutism that isn't even addressing my argument. They address a straw man. I'm not saying that the Roman Catholic Church is false because of money, because of wealth, because of greed. Those things might be things that led to the collapse. I'm saying that there's a dogmatic contradiction which refutes the papal system, because the papal system claims that there can never be dogmatic contradictions. So very clear, very precise in that argumentation. If you want to know the reasons why the papacy eventually capitulated in the 20th century to the geopolitical pressures to accept the Americanist doctrine of religious liberty, 100% contradicting itself only a few decades prior in the encyclicals and dogmatic documents I mentioned, I have multiple podcasts and talks on the Operation Gladio, the texts that are out there on this, the many Operation Gladio texts, and the history of this CIA operation and how they were instrumental, according to Catholic scholar David Wimhoff, in influencing Vatican II to accept Nostra Aetate and Dignitatis Humanae, the religious liberty and ecumenist documents. And those things go together, as Wimhoff demonstrates, as a traditional Roman Catholic, by the way. So you can read about the deep secrets of the Vatican, the Jesuits, and Operation Gladio there, as well as here, the history of intelligence agencies and Operation Gladio, etc., and how essentially the Vatican Bank becomes a money laundering operation and tool for the mafia and the CIA, famously, during the Cold War, and it has never ceased to be corrupt in that way, and that is also the source of today's Vatican corruption. So you have to go into the geopolitics and the history to understand this criminal conspiracy. And when you do, it begins to make sense. But most tradcats won't do this. They've never gone here. And that's why they also won't address the obvious contradiction that the Roman Catholic Church no longer says you have to believe in the temporal supremacy to be saved. If you like this, head on over to chalk.com and use the promo code J40 to get 40% off all those great products at chalk.com, or the promo code J44Life to get 44% off recurring subscriptions.